The Suzuki e-Vitara is 37 years old, and conveniently the e-Vitara is the manufacturer's first fully electric vehicle. Now at the time of filming and in the UK, it's available in two different trims, two different battery pack configurations, and effectively three different powertrains. Here, prices range from roughly £30,000 and go up to roughly £38,000. Although right now, Suzuki is also offering a £3,750 discount, therefore taking prices down to roughly £26,000 and extending up to roughly £34,000. Now, no matter which trim level you go for, you'll find a 10-year or 100,000 miles transferable warranty. That's actually quite a rarity, specifically in the all-electric market, because not only is the battery pack covered, but so is the car for that period of time. Now, in this review, which will be covered in such a format, we'll see if it's actually worth its price tag and, of course, how it compares to some of its key competitors. But before proceeding, I would just like to point out that if you do want to find some of the best deals for it, make sure you check out the links down in the description below or the pinned comments, or by scanning the QR code that can be found on your screen. So let's kick things off and talk about its electric range. And here you've got a 49 and 61 kilowatt hour battery packs. To be more specific, they're the BYD Blade battery with a LFP chemistry, lithium iron phosphate, in case you're wondering. Now here you have got a WLTP mixed driving cycle claim of 213 miles on the smaller battery pack, and then this moves over to 245 to 264 miles on the larger battery pack. In case you're wondering why there's a bit of a discrepancy with the larger battery pack model, that's quite simply because it's offered as both a two-wheel drive and four-wheel drive vehicle. Now in terms of a heat pump, it does actually come included as standard across the entire trim range, which is actually pretty good to see and quite refreshing, considering a lot of the alternatives either don't include it whatsoever or indeed charge quite a substantial extra. It's actually quite refreshing from the manufacturer to actually think this through. However, when it came to my own mixed driving tests, which were done on the country roads, on the motorway and within the city, on the two-wheel drive 61 kilowatt hour battery pack model, I netted a measly 160 to 180 miles. Now sure enough, that's not too terrible, and it might suffice for some consumers. However, if you do look at the mileage leaderboard and consider some of the alternatives out there, which also come in at roughly the same sort of price tag, it's actually quite disheartening to see that the Suzuki e-Vitara doesn't quite compete, and therefore means that if electric range is your utmost priority, then you might want to look elsewhere. It's also worth mentioning over here that I would expect to hit south of 130 miles if I was choosing the entry-level 49 kilowatt hour battery pack model. Now, another thing that I'm not overly fond of are the regenerative braking options. See, for you to adjust them while you're on the move, you'll have to faff around with the infotainment system, and that can be actually quite cumbersome. But still, over here, it's good to see that you have got a few different options to choose from, and also a memory functionality. Now, in order for you to actually enable regenerative braking, there's a button that can be found via the center console, and by pressing it, it'll effectively initiate the level that you've chosen by the infotainment system. Now you have actually got a pretty harsh deceleration, at least on its highest preset, although you do not have a full one-pedal drive. In other words, if you lift off the accelerator pedal, it won't come to a complete standstill. So therefore, when you're just pottering in around town, you'll still have to resort to using the physical brake pedal. Something I thought I should highlight, because some of its competitors do indeed offer such functionality, making it just a little bit more practical to use on a day-to-day basis, namely if you're commuting within the city. Another thing to consider is its relatively slow charge rate, and here you've got 70 kilowatts of input only, which therefore means that going from 10 to 80% will take you 45 minutes, significantly longer than what you'd find on rival alternatives. Although it is touted that Suzuki is going to be upping the charge rate over a software update, so therefore this might be a little bit of a moot point. Now, in terms of its Type 2 port, you have got an 11 kilowatt onboard charger, and therefore if you do find an appropriate charge point, which has got three-phase power supply, you can go from 0 to 100% in roughly 4.5 to 5.5 hours, depending on the battery pack chosen. As for a regular 7 kilowatt wall box, it'll take you between 6.5 hours and 9 hours. Unsurprisingly over here, if you have a 3-pin input, it'll take you significantly longer. So moving swiftly on, we get onto driving comfort. And here it's not exactly perfect, nor is it the worst in its class. See, here you have got a MacPherson strut setup at the front with a multi-link configuration at the back. The combination means that when you're going over potholes and speed bumps, you'll sometimes feel the rebound, and equally if you're going to be chucking around winding country routes, well, it does suffer from a little bit of body lean, although it's not too bad in the grander scheme of things. Here I do think it's somewhat mediocre in comparison to the vast alternatives out there on the market, in that it's neither too soft nor is it too hard. However, what does stand out is in terms of the overall driving connection. Now don't get me wrong, it hasn't got that one-to-one input like you'd find on some sportier SUVs, namely those that come in at a much steeper price point, but in comparison to a lot of the other vehicles which just feel a little bit lofty when going around winding roads, well here you just have a little bit better connection with the road. So therefore Suzuki have tried to tailor around the e-Vitara to make it a little bit more engaging to drive, and therefore does feel a little bit better, specifically when you're in the sport mode preset. Now this does actually perfectly bring me onto performance, and the stats and figures will be on your screen. What you should know is that the front-wheel drive 49 kWh model will go from 0 to 62 miles an hour in a claimed 9.6 seconds. The 61 kWh battery model will go in 8.7 seconds, while the four-wheel drive 61 kWh model will achieve this in 7.4 seconds. Now I had the larger battery pack with the front-wheel drive configuration tested using RaceLogic's Performance Pulse Touch, from 0 to 20 miles an hour in 2.48 seconds, 0 to 30 miles an hour in 3.73 seconds, 0 to 60 miles an hour in 8.72 seconds, so it's not too far off the manufacturer's claim, 50 to 70 miles an hour in 4.62 seconds, and also a peak acceleration of 0.38 G. Its top speed is electronically limited to 93 miles an hour. Now those figures aren't exactly going to set your world alight, and even on the four-wheel drive vehicle, it's not exactly all that nippy, specifically if you consider some of the alternatives out there on the market. Now where the e-Vitara really stands out is in terms of its off-roading capabilities. Not only because Suzuki has got 55 years of experience in the 4x4 market, but also because you have got a system called All Grip E, which effectively tries to mimic a limited slip differential. And thanks to the hill descent and the trail modes, where the latter effectively tries to prevent wheels from spinning around and effectively distributing power correctly, it means that you've got increased degree of traction and confidence on those harder terrain. Now I was actually able to put them through their paces in an off-piste route via the manufacturer. And not only did I have an absolute blast, but I also did find it absolutely fascinating to see how well the vehicle's able to cope. I can't think of many other electrified vehicles or even petrol vehicles that would have been able to cope with such a scenario. Sure enough, there's some which will cost significantly more, and you have got the Subaru Solterra in the all-electric market, but again that does come in at a steeper price point. So what Suzuki are trying to offer with the e-Vitara and the four-wheel drive vehicle, bringing it at a more affordable price point, is actually quite novel. So next up we get onto its interior design, and in the Motion trim you've got an all fabric material, while this then moves over to fabric and leather in the top spec Ultra trim, which is pictured. Now I do think it lacks a little bit of imagination, and the use of materials around the cabin could have been a little bit more premium. Specifically you do consider its overall price tag and also some of the alternatives out there in the market. But nonetheless, what I do absolutely love is the fact that the manufacturer has preserved physical buttons and dials on the steering wheel, traditional stalks, and even dedicated climate control buttons that can be found via the dashboard. It just makes it all that more intuitive to use and also to interact with, which isn't the same that could be said about the vast majority of its competitors. Now in terms of the use of technology, you have got a 10.1 inch display that's planted towards the center of the dashboard, and it's relatively intuitively laid out with certain options for you to play around with, although there are certain things that are kind of hidden and will take you a little while to get used to. For example, if you've got route guidance via the built-in navigation system, for you to mute it, you'll have to go via the sound tab that can be found within the settings, rather than just simply finding it via the navigation app itself, which I just think is just a little bit counterintuitive. Of course, this can be addressed via future firmware updates. Now, as for the other display that sits right beside it, it serves as your instrument cluster. It actually weighs in at 10.25 and therefore being slightly larger, and it provides you all the key driving information that you require, such as your safety systems that are in operation and your traversing speeds. And it's also somewhat customizable in terms of the look and the menus that are displayed. Aside from all of this, a head-up display is not present as standard or available as an option, which I do think is a slight missed trick, because it adds to the overall safety credentials while you're driving by keeping your eyes planted on the road. And this is a feature that some of its competitors actually do offer. In terms of its overall audio system, it's a little lackluster, both in terms of the stock and upgraded systems. In the entry-level Motion trim, you've got a 4-speaker setup where you have got woofer drivers that are found within each of the 4 doors. And then in the top spec Ultra trims, you have got the 4 woofers which have been upgraded, tweeters within the dashboard, and then also a subwoofer that's side-mounted within the boot, therefore taking the tally up to 7. Now, even the upgraded audio system doesn't do all that well across a sound frequency range, specifically lacking in terms of the overall mid-range, in other words, the overall vocal tones. Still will suffice for basic music listening, and of course if you're just listening to the news. So next up we get onto storage, and here it's good to see that the glove box has been optimized for right-hand drive vehicles. Then towards the center console and at the top, you've got a small little area for a wireless charger, and this is actually only present in the Ultra trim. Further down you've got 2 cup holders, and then you have got an area that's found within the center armrest. Although it's a shame over here that it's not been lined in any sort of fabric or non-slip material. Nonetheless, it's relatively large. Then you have got an area that is found underneath the center console. Here you'll find a 12-volt socket and some USB sockets as well, which can be used to connect up to the infotainment system. In terms of the rear of the center console, you've also got 2 further USB Type A and Type C ports and a small little area which can be handy for placing a smartphone. Then you've also got a pull-down armrest compartment which reveals 2 cup holders. And in fact, unlike a lot of the alternatives out there, this is actually the middle row which completely drops down, therefore meaning that you'll be able to see what is being lugged around in the boot. In terms of the door bins themselves, they're pretty large and accommodating, both at the front and at the rear. But yet again, it's a little bit disappointing that they're not being lined in any sort of fabric material, and therefore means that your loose change or your keys will be heard rattling about when you're traversing on uneven terrain. Now this does bring me onto its boot, and here you've got 238 to 244 litres to play around with, and this can actually be expanded by sliding the rear seats forwards to 306 to 310 litres. Not exactly massive figures, but it should certainly suffice for the vast majority of consumers. A total figure, in other words up to the roofline, has not been shared by the manufacturer, so I don't want to cause any sort of confusion when it comes to comparing and contrasting it with some other alternatives. Nonetheless, it's actually very practical, with a hatchback design. And here it's actually manually operated, where the tailgate itself is actually very light, so therefore it won't be problematic. Furthermore, you've got 40-20-40 rear split folding seats with a completely flat loading bay, thanks to the small little inclusions by the manufacturer, therefore making it completely flat even if you were to slide the rear seats forwards. As for an underfloor compartment, it is definitely there. It will suffice for taking your charging cables and your tyre repair kit among a few other valuables. The only downside, however, is that the manufacturer has not optimized the front of it. In other words, there is no front compartment, which is a slight shame because here it would have added extra bit of practicality to the vehicle. As for its towing capacity, it's rated at 750 kilograms. This is for brake trailers and is in line with a lot of its competitors. Next up we get onto seating comfort, and here I had no issues whatsoever at the front or rear of the cabin. The seats themselves are very accommodating and soft. It is worth mentioning, however, that if you want 10-way power controls for the driver, you'll have to go for the Ultra trim. Furthermore, in the 49 kWh Motion trim, you will not have a heated steering wheel, heated front seats, or rear heater outlets. However, this does become present on all the 61 kWh models. In terms of the rear seats themselves, they're actually movable and also have got a reclining function, which is actually quite a bit of a rarity. In terms of the overall legroom, it was a non-issue, specifically with the seats slid all the way back. And as someone who's just under 6 foot, I did feel that headroom in the rear outer seats was actually perfectly fine, although was a little bit tight, specifically in terms of the rear middle seat. Thankfully, however, the manufacturer has optimized the footwell design by keeping it completely flat, therefore meaning that in terms of practicality and also comfort, well, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Elsewhere, I would also like to highlight that in the Ultra trim, you've got a glass roof with a manually operated sunshade, which is very much appreciated as it brings in some extra light within the cabin. Now, what about when it comes to its exterior design? Well, I'll be curious to hear your thoughts down in the comment section below. Subjectively, I've got no complaints considering the fact that it is aimed at the off-road crowd as well. therefore meaning you've got plastic inserts towards the front, side and the rear, and therefore it's got a bit more of that robust, rugged look to it. Now in terms of the headlights themselves and also the tail lights, they've got this three-pronged design, which I actually quite like, and therefore gives it a somewhat modern flair. Towards the side, you've got a nice sort of silhouette, and at the rear, it's got a little bit more of a forward-thinking design, and still in line with the brand's DNA. And therefore means that when you combine all of the different design elements, it does actually look the part. In terms of your overall color options, it comes as standard in white. If, however, you want a single tone metallic finish, it'll cost you an additional £650, while a dual tone metallic finish, which is only available in the Ultra trims, costs an additional £950. And as for the alloys, they come as standard in 18 or 19 inch, depending if you go for the Motion or the Ultra trim. Moving on from its exterior design, it brings me on to safety. And here it scored 4 out of 5 stars in Euro NCAP's crash tests, scoring 77% in adult occupancy, 85% in child occupancy, and 72% in its safety assist scores. Here you've also got a plethora of driver assistance systems that come featured as standard in both trim levels. Adaptive cruise control, which actually does work a treat, multiple collision braking, automated emergency braking system, a blind spot monitoring system, rear cross traffic alert, lane keep assist with lane departure prevention, traffic sign recognition, driver monitoring system, and intelligent speed assistance. Now, while all of these are very much appreciated, it's worth noting that they will become re-enabled every single time you power on the vehicle, which is somewhat of a regulatory requirement and a bit of a bugbear for me. Here, in order to disable them, you can actually assign one of the buttons on the steering wheel in order to disable the likes of the traffic sign recognition system or the lane keep assistance. However, if you do want to play around with the other settings, you have to faff around with the infotainment system itself. And given it's a little bit sluggish and also requires you to go in a variety of different steps in order to disable them, I do think the manufacturer has not fully thought it through in terms of its overall customer base. Now to conclude, we should talk about parking and visibility, and I had no issues whatsoever. The vehicle has got a 10.4 meter turning circle, therefore making it very easy to maneuver. You've got front and rear parking sensors and a rear view camera that come fitted as standards. In the Ultra trim, you've also got a 360-degree view, which gives you some extra peace of mind. Visibility at the back is also not too bad, given the overall size of the vehicle and the fact that you've also got a wiper. So with all that in mind, it brings us on to our verdict of the Suzuki e-Vitara. And sure enough, over here, its electric range, the use of technology, and also the interior design do feel quite lackluster in comparison to some of its key competitors, namely in terms of the MSRP that the manufacturer is actually asking for. Although here, if you do consider the grant that's been applied, at least from the manufacturer and of course right now, then you've got a vehicle that does tick quite a few boxes. It's pretty comfortable to drive, it's quite unique in terms of its offering a four-wheel drive vehicle, at least in the all-electric market, and therefore makes it handy for cross-country terrain. You then also have good set of driver assistance systems, good amount of legroom for your rear occupants, and a decent boot capacity. So therefore, do consider it, at least if you're looking for an electric SUV. Now, I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below and how you feel it compares to some of its key competitors. If you've enjoyed this detailed independent review, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Chris from TotallyEV and I'll hopefully see you next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.